right, sustainability defined listeners, thanks for joining us. You've got Jay and Scott here, still defining sustainability one topic and one bad joke at a time. Thank you for joining us today. Happy New Year to everyone. 2022 is here. It feels very like a sci-fi year. I don't know, Jay, if that has struck you.
Well, a sci-fi in what way?
It's just like 2022. I feel like that's the year that someone would put at the bottom of a movie for the future.
So it's like the phase 2 of like 1989 or like year 2000 kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. We want to tell everyone that we are doing an updated episode today. Next month, we have a whole new episode coming. It's on personal, sustainable investing. We're really stoked about this one because we feel like it's very, like, right after the episode, you can go act on what we're talking about. And it's a big deal when you use your money in a way that can help advance sustainability. But there's a lot to consider, and we're going to get into that next month. So get excited for that. We're putting in a lot of time and effort into it and our money behind it, Jay. We got to invest our money.
Yeah, that's the thing, Scott. I mean, we'll be doing this like right alongside all the definers out there. So I think it's something that admittedly we're both personally and then perhaps, with the podcast funds as well.
Exactly.
A little bit late to the game too. So this was a fantastic opportunity both for us to learn how we want to do it and hopefully for you folks too.
Right. And then as we looked at, what episode do we want to update? We realized we hadn't done an energy one in a little while, and offshore wind's been in the news. So we said, let's do offshore wind. And so Amelia and Jay and myself, we got to work, and we've got a nice little update here for you. It's not too long, but we're going to have some cool updated stats here, and then we're going to replay the old episode.
Excellent.
So with that, Jay, why don't we dive in, huh?
Let's do it.
Or branch in? I don't know, something.
Now you're talking my language.
All right, so let's first talk offshore wind energy market generally. Give some updates, big picture. So U.S. Department of Energy, I think it's a good place to start, Jay.
Usually.
Their Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy states that for a variety of reasons, falling offshore wind prices, federal action, and state-level commitments, the U.S. offshore wind projects in development grew 24% in 2020, with a little over 35,000 megawatts in development. Okay, now let's talk, what is that, 35,000 megawatts? Well, that's enough capacity to power around 11.7 million U.S. homes for a year. So if these projects in development come online, that's a lot of homes.
Yeah, that's pretty substantial. However, though, Scott, when compared to other clean energy sources specifically, the American Clean Power Association found that offshore wind only represents 13% of the clean energy capacity currently in the pipeline. So meanwhile, onshore wind represents 23%, and solar takes the cake at 54%, with an honorable mention to battery storage at 9%. So folks, quick shout out to our episode 57 on energy storage. So interestingly, Scott, as we're looking at, what's changed in the market, we did find something that just kind of stood out in that the average rotor diameters, or really we're effectively talking about the blades on these turbines, have increased over time. And really, since we last did this episode, these blades now exceed 150 meters in length. That's over 1.5 football fields. And these offshore wind farm capacities now exceed 7.5 megawatts of production per day. So we're definitely seeing these cool milestones that we're hitting as the sector matures.
Okay, and speaking of large systems, Jay, let's talk about the biggest one that we've read about. So there's a New York Times article from early 2021. It highlighted a new test model for a new series of giant offshore wind turbines. Sounds like a scary movie or something. Planned by General Electric. So giant is actually being modest. The diameter here, you mentioned 1.5 football fields. Well, this one, longer than 2 football fields. And a single one of these giants can produce each day 13 megawatts of power. That's enough to power over 4,000 U.S. homes. So if you're interested in the offshore wind market, we definitely encourage you to check out Department of Energy's 2021 Offshore Wind Market Report. We'll link to that in the updated show notes. You can just Google it and find it as well. It's got great data on the offshore wind market, including the status of all the projects within the pipeline that we mentioned.
Excellent. So, talking updates from November 2018, we have a new administration in the White House. So in Biden's first week in office, his administration announced a 30,000 megawatts by 2030 national offshore wind energy goal. Now, this is considerable and really an ambitious goal since as of today, the U.S. only has 30 megawatts of utility-scale offshore wind production. So we're talking big goals here.
Yeah, so this 30,000 megawatts that they want to see by 2030, that would be enough power to meet the demand of more than 10 million American homes per year and would avoid 78 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, equivalent to taking 17 million cars off the road for a year. Further, if we do this, the administration projects that meeting it will trigger more than $12 billion per year in capital investments in these projects, create tens of thousands of good-paying union jobs with more than 44,000 workers employed in offshore wind by 2030, and nearly 33,000 additional jobs in communities supported by offshore wind activities. So many benefits to achieving this goal.
So, Scott, the question is, where does the existing 30 megawatts of utility-scale offshore wind production actually come from here in the U.S.? Mm-hmm. Well, it's a quick answer. That is the Block Island Wind Development, which is America's first offshore wind farm in Rhode Island that was completed in 2016.
And we talk about that in the original episode too, so you'll hear more about it.
That's right. Now, we will say, though, that 30 megawatts is set to change in a big way. The country's first commercial offshore wind farm, which is called Vineyard Wind, located off the Massachusetts island of Martha's Vineyard, received federal approval in May of 2021 and started construction in November, so just a couple months ago. It will have a capacity of 800 megawatts once it's complete in 2023.
And more evidence of the coming growth, Jay, is that 15 projects in the U.S. offshore pipeline have reached the permitting phase, and 8 states have set offshore wind energy procurement goals. Now, one issue here is making sure that all of this offshore wind, the onshore grid, can handle all this new energy. We're going to need to invest in our energy grid, which really, Jay, we've said this several times. That needs to be the focus of a future episode. But how the energy grid is invested in and how it is able to be capable of new energy from all the renewables, that's something to watch.
One day, let us proclaim, Scott, we will get to the grid.
Yes.
It will happen. Okay, so let's talk trends and global growth in offshore wind. Mm-hmm. Globally, the offshore wind energy industry installed more than 5,000 megawatts of capacity just in 2020 alone. For reference, total global offshore wind capacity at the end of 2020 reached 34,000 megawatts, which means global offshore wind installations in 2020 represented 16% of the total installed by the end of 2020.
So where's this growth coming from? Well, a little over 2,000 megawatts of new deployment was in the Chinese market, 1,500 in the Netherlands, about around 700 in the UK, and 700 in Belgium, a little over 300 in Germany, and then the rest of the world divides the rest of a little over 100. Now, if you're wondering, well, where's the largest offshore wind farm in the world? Well, the 2 Hornsea sites in England. They came online since our last episode, and collectively, the 2 sites produce enough power for 2.3 million UK homes.
Those things must be enormous.
Yeah, I bet.
So the little more than 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind that was installed in 2020 that we referenced a few seconds ago, unfortunately, Scott, is pretty far from what's really needed. The International Energy Agency said earlier in 2021 that 80,000 megawatts of offshore wind will need to be added globally each year by 2030 to set the world on course for reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So put another way, that 5,000 relative to the 80,000 of what's needed, we're only at 6% of what's really needed according to the IEA.
Jay, I feel like if I were an offshore wind expert being interviewed on our podcast and I had the party fact question thrown at me, I'd probably pull this one out of my hat.
Right.
Like, that's pretty stark.
It's sobering. It's, motivating, perhaps in the right ways.
Yeah. All right. So let's also we're talking trends. Let's talk about support for these things. So according to a national survey conducted by Public Opinion Strategies in 2020, more than 80% of the U.S. voters, regardless of political party and demographic, favored adding more offshore wind to America's energy portfolio. Now, interestingly, that same study states that a majority of voters think wind energy will be more important to the economy in 10 years than oil and natural gas. I mean, I think to do that, we need to meet President Biden's goal and make some serious progress. So we'll see.
To our surprise, on top of that, support for offshore wind is not solely found in coastal states, with those in the South at 90% and those in the Midwest at 89%, viewing it most favorably. And I have to wonder, perhaps that's because they don't have to look out at big turbines on the water if they're not, if they're landlocked. But anyways, glad to see that that's well distributed. Furthermore, when Congress passed its second stimulus package back in late 2020, it included wind and solar tax credit extensions and added the first U.S. offshore wind tax credit. This tax credit gives offshore wind projects for the first time a 30% investment tax credit for projects that began construction starting January 1st of 2017 and running through December 31st of 2025. So cool to see some real policy incentives backing this up.
Yeah, I somehow missed that. I didn't know that tax credit happened until we did the research for this episode. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then in terms of costs, so globally, according to that same DOE report we keep talking about, the average levelized cost of energy. So this is a common term used, really refers to measuring lifetime costs divided by energy production. So this levelized cost of energy of fixed bottom offshore wind energy installations is now below $95 per megawatt hour. So that's a 16% reduction on average compared to what was being reported in 2019. So we're seeing some price declines, and of course that's important to get further investment.
That's right. So Scott, we've talked costs, we've talked trends. What about any potential pushback that we've seen on offshore wind?
Right. I mean, there's been some pushback even from some environmentalists and conservationists talking about, well, what's going to be the impact of these offshore wind energy installations on coastal ecosystems? There have been some studies that have said, well, the introduction of them can increase noise levels, escalate collision risk, change habitats, and alter food webs. Just to give more recent news, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they did find in its assessment of offshore wind energy leasing activities off the coast of New York Bight that they will have, quote, no significant impact to the environment. So if you haven't heard of the New York Bight, I hadn't. I had to Google it. It's a geological formation near the New York and New Jersey border near the mouth of the Hudson River. So this environmental impact question, it's still a hot one. There's plenty of studies coming out all the time, and government agencies, they have to look at this, as part of approving these sort of projects.
Right. And Scott, I'm going to interject here. We see it written out, but folks, Bight is spelled B-I-G-H-T, not B-I-T-E. So we're not talking about, like a New York, bite of cheesecake. This is something different, just to be clear.
I'm surprised you didn't go pizza or bagels.
I was going to go pizza. Oh, bagels. That's where it would have been.
Oh, yes.
Oh, man. Oh, hindsight. Okay. Additionally, Scott, we're talking about potential pushback on offshore wind. We do, though, have Gary George, who's the director of the National Audubon Society's Clean Energy Initiative, stating in an article recently that, quote, as the lives of billions of birds hang in the balance due to climate change, responsibly sited and reviewed clean energy projects like Vineyard Wind, which we mentioned here a few minutes ago, are critical to their survival. We look forward to working with Vineyard Wind to ensure that the project continues to move forward in a way that avoids, minimizes, and mitigates the impact on the environment. So, Scott, this is under this topic of pushback, but what we're saying here is that there's actually some collaboration that's going on that I think is certainly pretty welcome.
Yeah, I think the National Audubon Society is trying to work with some government agencies and saying, hey, do this, do that, that'll help the birds. I think they want to avoid the birds being used as like a way for those who want to try to stop these things. Say, oh, what about the birds, when they really are just trying to stop these projects?
Right.
And the National Audubon Society, I think rightly so, saying, hey, we need this stuff to reduce the threat of climate change. That's going to hurt birds way more.
Yeah.
Don't want to hurt birds at all, but kind of got to be a bit utilitarian here, I guess.
Yeah, let's go about it in a smart way.
All right, so Jay, let's wrap this up here. Give some final thoughts.
Okay, so in our research, Scott, we found a Rolling Stone article that does a nice job of summarizing the future opportunity based on an International Energy Agency study focusing on offshore wind. So the article goes, quote, so vast is the potential for offshore wind energy that the IEA predicts that by 2040, the industry will be 15 times larger than it is currently, and that it will garner $1 trillion in investment. The forthcoming boom is due to lowering costs and technological developments like larger turbines and turbines that float. If the potential for floating turbines is realized, offshore wind energy could generate 11 times the global demand for electricity by 2040. So let's let that one sink in. Scott, I know you also saw this one. What's a party fact too? So saying offshore wind energy could generate 11 times the global demand for electricity by 2040. So it's all kind of there for the taking, right? If we're looking only at offshore wind. That being said, the estimate does not factor in difficulties in transmitting and storing the power that's generated, but still, that's huge. That's big.
Yeah, totally. This would probably be the other party fact I'd want to pull out of my hat if I had to. I mean, we didn't really talk much about floating turbines. I mean, it's probably very early stages, I think, for that. But man, the opportunity here is just huge.
Huge.
So if you really want to dive deep into this topic of offshore wind, we recommend you check out the podcast series Windfall. It's from another great environment podcast called Outside In. This is a podcast from New Hampshire Public Radio. And over the course of 5 episodes, you get an entertaining look at why offshore wind has developed more slowly in the United States. Like, why are we still at that 30 megawatts, right? Mm-hmm. But how can we make a bunch of progress going forward? And then also the Business Network for Offshore Wind has a podcast called Official Wind Insider, the network's podcast. You may recall that we interviewed Liz Burdock, their president and CEO, for our original episode, and she's still there doing her thing as president and CEO.
What do you know?
Yeah, so you'll hear from her in just a bit. We're going to replay the original episode now, and we look forward to seeing you next month for a totally brand spanking new episode.
Here we go.
All right, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Defined. Jay and I still here, defining sustainability one concept and one bad joke at a time. Today, we return to energy. Finally, haven't been here since solar finance. We're going to talk offshore wind.
All right, Scott, let's dive in and discuss our overview for this episode. We're going to start with the basics of wind and then move into how wind turbines work. We'll then go through the history of the wind energy industry and then discuss the differences between offshore and onshore wind farms. We'll then touch on an overview of the offshore wind energy market specifically before then diving into trends that are shaping the industry into the future. Then, of course, we'll touch on resources for listeners before segueing into our 2 interviews coming up later in this episode.
Jay, I totally thought you were going to say, and now we're going to blow you on over to or something like that.
Blow your socks off doesn't really work, but regardless, we still think it's a pretty good intro.
Okay, so let's do the basics of wind. It's just like, what is wind? You know, it's kind of important. And wind occurs when air moves from high pressure to low pressure areas on the Earth's surface. So when the sun warms the air, it becomes less dense and it rises. And as air rises, the pressure lowers and surrounding air moves in to replace it, causing wind.
So the more the difference in high and low pressure, the faster the air moves. This difference in pressure is caused by uneven heating of the Earth's surface, which happens due to the Earth's rotation around the sun and due to different land and water formations absorbing the sun's radiations unevenly. Okay, so with the basics of wind in mind, let's discuss how wind turbines work. So when wind blows, it carries kinetic energy, which can move objects. A wind turbine has blades which are specifically designed to rotate when hit by the wind. This motion is vital to the generation of electricity. In fact, the earliest turbines, or windmills really, used materials like cloth to achieve this exact same effect.
Okay, so most wind turbines today, they start operating at a pretty low wind speed of about 3 to 5 meters per second, think a gentle breeze. And as the blades of the turbine spin, they turn a shaft in the nacelle, or the box, on top of wind turbine. A generator, which is built into the nacelle, then converts that rotational energy into electrical energy, which then needs to be transformed into a suitable voltage to be connected to the grid or used by a local site. So regardless of the size or location of a wind turbine, they all use the same mechanics in order to generate electricity. And really, it's similar to how coal and natural gas is all about boiling water to create steam to turn a generator. You know, you're always turning things to create energy.
So quickly, let's just run through the history of wind energy. So people have been using wind for a long time. They've been using it to propel boats along the Nile River as early as 5000 BC. In America, colonists use wind farms to grind grain, pump water, and cut wood at sawmills.
A little bit of a jump there in time.
Slight. Styles and outfits changed slightly. So, small wind turbines were widely used in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but their use began to decline when power lines were built to transmit electricity to rural areas in the 1930s.
Okay, so let's talk offshore wind history. In 1991, the world's first offshore wind farm called Vindeby was built in Denmark, because where else would it be built, with 11 450 kilowatt turbines. The first large-scale offshore wind farm, Middelgrunden,
amazing,
thank you, was erected off Copenhagen in 2000 with 22 megawatt turbines, so about 8 times larger than Vindeby. The first offshore wind farm in the U.S. was the Block Island Wind Farm, which came online in December 2016, so quite a bit after those European ones. Its 5 turbines power 17,000 homes on a small island that had been disconnected from Rhode Island's main grid and was relying on dirty diesel. So I'm glad they got the offshore wind in there.
I'm just hoping we can work in as many references to Middelgrunden as possible, Scott, just to hear you say it. But let's discuss now a critical distinction in the wind industry, which is onshore versus offshore wind farms. So there are really key differences between these two types of farms in terms of efficiency, cost, and marine life. So starting with number 1, which is efficiency. Offshore farms tend to be more efficient than onshore farms, as wind speed and direction are more consistent on offshore locations. This means that fewer turbines are required to provide the same amount of electricity as onshore turbines. Number 2 is cost. Onshore wind farms on land tend to be less expensive than offshore farms on the ocean, and we'll come back to more on this in a bit.
So a third difference is marine life. Offshore wind has the potential to harm marine mammals. This brings me back to my National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration days here, Jay. Northeast U.S. coastal waters, they teem with marine life. This includes the endangered North Atlantic right whale. So precautions have to be taken to make sure that construction and operations of these offshore wind farms minimize harm to them. One major issue is ocean noise. And the noise here comes from construction activities, including driving steel piles. These piles are the foundation for some types of turbines, and they get driven into the ocean floor. An example of a best practice to avoid harm from the noise that comes from driving these piles in is using something called a bubble curtain. It puts sleeves around the piles to diminish noise as they're hammered down.
It sounds like they're just big old things of bubble wrap.
I doubt it. In fact, that would probably create more noise as they pop. But
so, unfortunately, Scott, both of these types of wind farms have the issue of harm to birds. So estimates vary, but it's several 100,000 bird deaths a year due to wind turbines. This sounds like a lot, but it's actually quite a lot less than bird deaths due to cats, which is a couple billion, and collisions with buildings, which is hundreds of millions. That's just such a great example that I'm sure everyone has experienced. But Scott, I gotta say, talking about these bird deaths reminds me of that video of Hall of Fame pitcher Randy Johnson, right, who's throwing his fastball to the plate in a baseball game at the precise moment a pigeon flies across home plate. Collision, explosion of feathers, and we added one more bird death to the unfortunate tally.
Seriously bad luck. Watch it on YouTube. The Big Unit. It's a great nickname, by the way.
Yeah, watch it multiple times. It's fascinating.
Also, I just quickly, the cats. I didn't know cats kill that many birds. But
a couple billion a year.
Yeah,
That's like
it's a thing, I guess.
Hand it to the cats. But Scott, why don't you give us an overview of the offshore wind energy market specifically?
Okay, so the Global Wind Energy Council proclaimed that 2017, a spectacular year for the offshore wind sector. A historical record of a little over 4,300 megawatts of new offshore wind power was installed across 9 countries globally in 2017. This represents a 95% increase on the 2016 market. There's a lot of offshore wind going in. Overall, there are now over 18,000 megawatts of installed offshore wind capacity in 17 countries around the world. That's enough to power the equivalent of nearly 9 million homes in the New York, New Jersey area. By that math, it's about 500 homes per megawatt. So keep that in mind when Jay and I throw out how many megawatts something is. 500 homes per megawatt of offshore wind at least.
So, Scott, at the end of 2017, nearly 84% of all offshore installations were located in the waters off the coast of 11 European countries. The UK, in fact, is the world's largest offshore wind market and accounts for just over 36% of installed capacity, followed by Germany in the second spot with 28.5%, and China coming in third with just under 15%.
All right, Jay, so I'm imagining at this point our American listeners are like, what the heck? Why aren't we doing more here? The good news is that the U.S. market is poised to be the next breakout market for offshore wind development. This is due to technological improvements that have made it so large subsidies no longer really needed to make this economically viable. And as we're going to learn, states making a lot more purchases and being more interested in offshore wind.
And so to get there, Scott, let's discuss trends that are going on in the offshore wind energy. Number one being cost, a crucial component. So McKinsey noted in a 2017 report that offshore wind tended to be 40% more expensive than onshore wind on a levelized cost of electricity basis. So for reference, levelized cost is a metric that incorporates total lifetime costs and expected production of a wind farm. So costs are higher for offshore wind because building at sea requires more materials for foundations and piles, and rough weather conditions make installation, operation, and maintenance more expensive. On top of that, offshore wind farms also require expensive connectors to the inland transmission network.
Second trend is new technology. One that we're seeing is offshore winds are getting taller. The turbines are getting taller to access more consistent wind resources.
Right. We also have next generation wind turbine blades that stretch over 70 meters and will help the wind turbine capture more wind as efficiently as possible. For me, to put this number in context, these 70-meter blades are nearly the length of a football field. These will enable capacity for energy generation to increase, all while the installed cost per kilowatt falls and plant life expectancy grows. Turbines will also increasingly incorporate intelligent controls and remote monitors to increase overall efficiency.
So, third trend is what we referred to earlier. The U.S. market's growing. That means more contracts, more jobs. And some states have ambitious offshore wind targets. Two of the most ambitious are New York and New Jersey. New York, they've got a target of 2,400 megawatts by 2030. And it actually already has one offshore wind project under contract and plans another major procurement of about 800 megawatts in late 2018. So it's already well on its way to its goal. Other states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, they've all rewarded offshore wind contracts. The Department of Energy's offshore wind project pipeline, to give you a sense of how much is going to come soon, has 25,464 megawatts of capacity across 13 states in it. Sounds like a lot, and it is, but for comparison, Europe's offshore pipeline is over 100,000 megawatts.
Yeah, so 4 times larger, but hey, we got to start somewhere, right, Scott?
Yeah, we're on our way.
So we should also note that the DOE said in its National Offshore Wind Energy Strategy Report that the industry could support 150,000 jobs in the U.S. by 2050. In fact, a Workforce Development Institute study found that building an offshore wind power plant requires a diverse technical workforce spanning an estimated 74 different occupations.
I love that, Jay. I love the diversity, and it also means we got to pick up the job training, right?
Absolutely. But hey, that's the magic political word, right? Jobs. Here they are. They are windy jobs.
That's my platform.
You got my vote. So, of course, let's touch on some resources for listeners to connect them with offshore wind energy. So if your power provider allows, opt for programs that include a mix of offshore wind energy or really any renewable energy source for that matter. For example, try to find an organization like Clean Power SF, which is based in San Francisco, in your area. Clean Power SF advertises the ability for you to keep your same energy service while opting for cleaner energy, whether you're a residential or a commercial user.
And also take your passion to the polls. Scan the ballot, see if there's some something on there that would support the offshore wind industry, and also look at the platforms of the politicians. Make sure they're supporting this industry.
All right, Scott, let's blow on over to our interview portions coming up. Our first guest is Benj Sykes, who is the head of program asset management and the UK country manager at Orsted. He is responsible for the business performance of the company's portfolio of operating wind farms across northwestern Europe. Also, Scott, I find this interesting. Benj previously worked at Hess Corporation, which is a Fortune 100 oil and gas company. So he will be able to tell us what life was like on the dark side.
Oh my God. It's not the dark side, man.
It's too easy.
I did watch Star Wars Episode 8 last night. I don't think he was Kylo Ren. Okay.
You didn't see Benj in that flick?
No.
That's good.
Neither did I see our other guest, Liz Burdock. She is the CEO and president of the Business Network for Offshore Wind. This is a national 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to building the U.S. offshore wind supply chain. This private sector, membership-driven organization acts as a collaborative entity to deliver educational programming, conduct outreach, and bolster bilateral cooperation in the offshore wind industry. All right, Jay, you did the interview with Ben. I did the interview with Liz. Both are awesome, and I think our listeners are going to learn a lot hearing from them. So let's go.
All right, I am here on a sunny day in London, UK, sitting across the table from Benj Sykes, who is the UK country manager for Orsted's offshore wind business. Benj, thanks so much for your time for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure.
So I like to start off at a very interesting point relative to your experience. So you mentioned earlier that you started your career in the oil and gas industry as a geologist at Shell. Eventually, of course, you worked your way over into the clean tech and then ultimately the renewable energy space. So what was your experience like in oil and gas, and what led you over to the greener side of things?
That's a really good question and a great place to start. I trained as a geologist. I went to Cambridge and studied geology for 3 years. Fantastic. Thought about going to the water industry, ended up falling into Shell. I had a great international career there. And it's a really exciting sector to work in. Back in the 1980s, of course, climate change was an issue that was only just starting to emerge into the national and international consciousness. I spent several years at Shell, then I went to work for Hess Corporation. Spent more than a decade working for Hess in the US across various parts of Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Had a really cool time, actually. But in the end, I started a family, and I really thought, you know what, I want to create a sustainable future for my family. And as my kids have grown up, they've really pushed me as well to find a different way to use my skills and experience to create a clean future for them.
And so was that a hard transition for you from this moment of thinking, all right, I want to get into the sustainable world? Was that something you could snap your fingers and do? Were your skills easily transferable, or was it more of a process for you?
It's funny to reflect. It was less difficult than I thought, in fact. I had done a really eclectic set of jobs when I was in the oil industry, everything from corporate restructuring to developing oil fields through to relationships with governments in North Africa. So a whole mix of things. What really excited me about getting into renewables was it was a growing industry. And I very quickly discovered that there was one bit of this sector called clean tech that was really interesting to me, and that was offshore wind, really because I like doing big stuff offshore. And it was great to be able to take the skills from doing that for oil and gas and switch that into offshore wind.
Perfect segue into the next question, which is, as I was doing my research and Scott, my co-host, was doing the research for this episode, I'm thinking, all right, this is really my first dive into really the wind energy specifically, and certainly the offshore component of that. So in a nutshell, do you know what it was that motivated Orsted to pursue offshore as opposed to onshore?
We were a really early adopter of this technology. We probably are the drivers behind why this sector's got to where it's got to. We, at the time, were a state-owned Danish energy company. And frankly, we took a punt. We thought, let's have a go. This looks like a really interesting idea. So we were the first movers, and we built up really deep expertise in the sector, whether it's engineering, whether it's the environmental processes around building offshore. So we took a bit of a gamble, and it's really paid off. It's put us as the world leaders in this technology now.
I have to imagine that was a tough gamble to make because, of course, the headlines now show that all of these costs for the inputs are falling. But that's now. What was it like then? Were the costs just almost scary to look at as you guys were diving into it?
They were very scary. And, of course, we were doing it at a much smaller scale then. So in terms of the cost to consumers, our ultimate customer, it wasn't so noticeable, but there was no doubt that there were many skeptics around as to whether this would ever be a technology that would be affordable as well as clean.
Okay, so back to your role here at Orsted as the UK country manager, where, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're responsible for the business performance of the company's portfolio of operating wind farms across Northwest Europe. Does that sound about correct?
Well, I've recently changed role, actually.
Oh, really?
So,
congratulations.
Yeah, so I built up what's called our asset management business here in the UK, and ultimately took that to be a global role. So I built up the business management side of our existing portfolio across our global footprint, which of course has always been Europe until recently. But I've now moved on. I also, as well as working here, I'm also the industry chair of what's called the Offshore Wind Industry Council, which is a partnership between industry and government. And that's really driving the future of the UK offshore wind industry by working with ministers, working with officials in government to make sure that this industry achieves its full potential. So I'm doing a lot to work with the business here in the UK, but also a lot at an industry level.
Perfect. So then perhaps on both a wind farm level and maybe even on the governmental international level, what are some of the biggest risks or impediments that you see to further growth in the industry?
I think to answer that question, you have to step back and look at where this industry's got to and where it's going to go. As I said earlier, the opportunity for this industry to grow was really not a given because of the cost of offshore wind until about 3-4 years ago when we started to see costs tumble. And we've seen, just in 2.5 years, we've seen the cost of future wind farms drop by 50% in terms of the cost of electricity. An extraordinary outcome. Mm-hmm. Of course, that creates a huge opportunity, but also challenges. And I think for the UK and for offshore wind more generally, we've got to be sure that as we deploy multiple tens of gigawatts of offshore wind around coasts globally, that we make sure we do that in an environmentally and ecologically sustainable way. And also on a more financial footing, we've also got to think about how do we make sure we build a strong industrial base that sits behind this industry so that we can reliably and continuously continue to drive costs down.
So to that point, is it almost more about your generating the electricity from these farms, but it's also the infrastructure behind where that electricity goes on its way to the network? Is that sound about right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the whole kind of offshore infrastructure is an interesting topic to get into. It's probably a bit too technical for today,
Sure.
But when you're building a wind farm, you're taking up several square miles of sea, several hundred square miles potentially. So
hundreds of square miles.
Yeah,
That's
these
massive.
are big wind farms.
Yeah.
These are big wind farms. I mean, the wind farm we're building off the east coast of the UK right now has an output equivalent to a nuclear reactor. These are not small things. When people think of wind power, they often think, a handful of turbines on a hill.
Right.
We're talking about 170 or more wind turbines over a large area, generating that output of over a gigawatt.
And for better or worse, it's almost something that regular folks don't see. Whether they're just in an airplane flying over it or you just can't see it from the coastline. That's massive.
That's right. It's huge. And as we get more experience, we're able to build them further from shore. Going further from shore is good for a number of reasons. Firstly, as you say, it's over the horizon. Those who aren't so keen on wind power don't need to look at turbines. Frankly, I think they're fantastic things to look at, but perhaps I'm a bit biased. But secondly, as you get further from shore, you get stronger winds, and that means being able to generate more electricity.
Absolutely. So you touched how your role has grown into almost more of a governmental international perspective. At the same time, we know that Britain and the UK is the world's largest offshore wind market with about 36% of globally installed offshore wind capacity. And we've also read that Orsted attributes much of its success in offshore wind that you spoke to continued governmental support.
That's absolutely right. The UK is the world leader. We've just passed 8 gigawatts of installed capacity. What does that mean? That means enough electricity to supply around about 8% of Britain's needs through the year. So it's a really significant part of the energy system. And getting to the stage and the scale that we're at today is very much down to consistent government policy. We've had various changes of government and different parties in power over the last 15 years. But across the political divide, there's been consistent support and recognition for this industry as having the potential to powering a clean economy in the UK.
It sounds like you guys would be a fantastic representation or role model for us across the pond. But this is a hard question, but do you think it's possible for countries without that strong governmental consensus to move the offshore wind industry forward? Or is it something that really does need some form of governmental backing?
I think it does need government support, and I'll explain why. Of course, costs have come tumbling down, as I said earlier, so it's not like you need the high levels of consumer and government funding to make these projects viable. We're already one of the lowest forms of low-carbon power generation. We're cheaper than building new gas plants, for example, for generating electricity. So from a cost perspective, we're pretty much there. But of course, you have to recognise offshore wind farms, all the cost is up front. So you need the kind of mechanisms in place that provide a reliable revenue stream. That's how you get banks, pension funds, and other institutional investors to put their money behind these wind farms. So I think having the policy framework to enable offshore wind to be cost effective and to be an investable proposition remains as important as ever.
Benj, this is a question we ask all of our esteemed guests. So envision that we are at some kind of pub, whether it's a local pub here in Britain or back in the UK, and we are talking with folks about offshore wind energy. And we want to give them some kind of fact or statistic to hang on to that will, no pun intended, blow their mind about the offshore wind industry. What might that be?
Well, I've got many facts I could throw into this mix, but how's about this one for a pub quiz moment? We've just installed the world's biggest offshore wind turbines just offshore Liverpool, and one of those turbines, one rotation of the blades produces enough electricity to drive your Tesla for 50 miles.
That is fantastic. Does Elon Musk know about this?
He doesn't, and I wouldn't recommend plugging your Tesla directly into the turbine. I think the battery might explode.
Might have a hard time driving offshore, too.
That is true. Possibly. You need a pretty long wire.
All right, well, Benj, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation with you.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, so I am here with Liz Burdock at GreenBiz Verge in Oakland, California. Liz is the president and CEO of the Business Network for Offshore Wind. So Liz, thank you so much for joining me in this lovely little kind of side room that we're in.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
Okay, so Liz, you've had a very interesting career where you first worked for the federal government, and then you did some consulting and lobbying gigs, and then you started a couple organizations, Green Works Partners, a green strategic consulting practice. And then in 2013, you founded the Business Network for Offshore Wind. So did you always know you wanted to start your own organizations? What learnings have you brought from those early government and consulting gigs to these organizations that you started?
I was always very entrepreneurial, even when I was inside of government and then in the lobbying firm, and always had essentially a small business practice within each one of those organizations. So it was sort of a natural progression for me to go out on my own and start my Green Works Partnering consulting firm, and then co-founding the Business Network for Offshore Wind in 2012.
Okay, so Liz, it seems like you were a bit of a generalist in your positions, helping companies with a variety of sustainability issues. And now you're with the Business Network for Offshore Wind. What led you to specialize and focus specifically on offshore wind?
I really started specializing in offshore wind because what I found was that even though we had energy efficiency and solar and onshore wind, the job creation wasn't as great as it is in the offshore wind industry. And I've always been focused on clean energy technologies that could be an economic boom for the United States. That's really where my passion is. And so that's why I started specializing and focusing on offshore wind.
This value add of offshore wind, where you were seeing the job creation side, is that why you decided to call it the Business Network for Offshore Wind? Because you saw that there was this job creation component and a business case for it?
Yes, it actually was. We decided to call it the Business Network for Offshore Wind for two reasons. One was because our focus was on the economic benefits that are derived from creating a U.S. offshore wind industry. We wanted to complement the environmental NGO side of the policy argument for climate change and really focus from not just what are the environmental wins, but what can the economic wins be. So that's really where our space is, and that's why we call it the business network. But we also call it a network because we're focused on connecting businesses together with one another to really build the U.S. offshore wind supply chain. We can't create this industry in the United States without companies working together. And so we found that it was really important to have a connector organization, much like in the tipping point when you want an industry to get up and running and then tip to the mainstream. You need that connector organization, and that's the role we really play.
Okay, so give me an example of the connecting you're trying to create. Like, show me how the different pieces you all bring in so that an offshore wind project can actually take place. And then what are the jobs that get created?
So that's a really complicated question, but I'll
That's my specialty.
Okay,
so.
Thanks a lot. So I'll start with this. First of all, the U.S. is very far behind Europe. Europe has an offshore wind industry for 20 years now, and they have a maturing supply chain in Europe. And it's one of the reasons why the costs have actually gone down in offshore wind globally because of their supply chain, the lessons learned, the experiences that they have gained, along with the technological advances. I promise I'm getting to the answer, Jay. I'm going to answer your question. But what we have found was that U.S. businesses, because we don't have an industry here, needed to partner with European businesses to build capacity and expertise in order for them to participate in the supply chain. So we invite businesses from Europe to come over, meet the U.S. businesses, partner together, not displace the U.S. businesses, but again, work together to build up capacity and expertise and actually land contracts in the various areas of the supply chain. So whether it's an engineering firm working together or a local welding company working with a steel fabricator from Europe or a coatings manufacturer from Europe, those are the types of areas in which we partner businesses together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're bringing over various parts of the offshore wind supply chain that are needed from abroad that aren't necessarily here in the United States to work with entities in the United States to say, okay, you're going to do this part, you're going to do that part, and let's land a contract together?
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, and that's very validating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's good. So I feel like a lot of our listeners, though, are probably saying, man, you guys are talking about offshore wind, but I haven't heard of any offshore wind projects in the United States. Like, what already exists? What is the reality of when we're going to see more? When's the average listener going to be driving along the coast and see offshore wind? How far are we away from that?
We are 5 years away from that. We have one project in the United States, and it's huge. It's 5 turbines sitting in the ocean off of Rhode Island in state waters. It's called Block Island Wind Farm. And
that's my favorite offshore wind farm right now.
Is it?
Did you know that?
That's great.
One of one.
Exactly. But what you're going to see is you're going to start seeing offshore wind farms dot the coast from Massachusetts all the way down to Virginia in the next 5 years. You'll see the next offshore wind project to go up will be off of the coast of Virginia. It will be another gigantic wind project. It will actually be 2 turbines sitting in federal waters for a total of 12 megawatts. But then after that, we go to full scale. We go to 800 megawatts of offshore wind, another 368 megawatts off the coast of Maryland, where I'm from, as well as about 1,800 megawatts between New York and New Jersey in the next 4 years.
Okay, so we're right on the edge here of some serious growth. And was there one thing that really led to this huge growth? Was it you all coming in and connecting the right European people to the right American people? Was there some change in state regulations? Like, what was it that there's been so many years now where people talked about offshore wind and the growth with wind on land, but why now is it you're able to say, well, in a couple years we'll have this 1,800 megawatts?
So I get asked that question a lot, And I actually think it was three things. First was the Block Island Wind Project. It actually went in the water in 2016, and people could see a tangible example of offshore wind with their own eyes.
That's the one that you mentioned already exists, the one of one.
Right, exactly. And then the second thing that happened was the state of Massachusetts passed the largest procurement legislation to date for 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. And that helped move the market forward. And the third thing that happened was that Orsted, the world's largest developer, came into the U.S. market. And those things all happened around 2016, along with, and I should say, with BOEM really, that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, really stepping up their leasing process and getting more wind sites leased off the coast. We now have 17 wind energy areas leased.
Okay, so I appreciate you walking me through those steps, and you mentioned how we're just several years away from a person driving along the East Coast going to see some serious offshore wind farms, perhaps. Right?
You're not going to see them from the coast.
You can't see them from the
No.
Okay. Well, there's some naivete on display. How far are we talking? How far out there?
At least 12 miles off the coast.
And is that because of that's just where they want to site them? Because don't you lose power the longer you transmit?
That is where they want to site them. That is where the sites have been deconflicted. I like to call it deconflicted, where all of the stakeholders have agreed that that's an area that can be developed for offshore wind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but ideally, would it be closer, or no? That's where they should be.
Of course, it would be great to have them closer because you're right. The transmission costs are greater the further out you go. However, with technology and all of the other confluence of factors going into lowering the cost, it really isn't an issue as much as it used to be.
Okay, and is the offshore wind technology fully mature, or is there some other tech that you think is going to be a game changer coming down the road, or you kind of have what you need?
So the game changer in offshore wind is floating offshore wind. That will be a game changer in the fact that it will open up deeper waters. Right now, we have fixed bottom offshore wind turbines that can only go into about 60 to 80 meters of sea depth. But once you have floating, we will be able to open up the vast majority of the U.S.'s offshore wind potential, almost 2,400 gigawatts of offshore wind then around both coasts. We're waiting for the technology, the floating technology, to be commercialized in Europe to be able to bring that over to places like California.
I don't know why, but when you say a floating offshore wind, I imagine it on an inner tube, or it has those floaties that little kids wear on their arms.
That's
stick it on the propellers, right?
That's what it looks like.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have to look up a photo of that. Okay, so let's go to our last question here, where let's imagine we're at a networking reception, say at GreenBiz, and we're there, and I want to tell them about offshore wind and blow their minds with some party fact about offshore wind. What is the one fact about offshore wind that I could tell them to blow their minds about it?
The cost of offshore wind has decreased by more than 50% in less than a year. In 2017, Maryland awarded their project financing for 368 megawatts at 13 cents a kilowatt hour. This year, Massachusetts announced their project financing at 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that is a 50% decrease in a very short time.
And so that decrease was driven by scale. So as projects get bigger, we can even see bigger decreases? That's amazing, in 1 year, 50% drop.
Yeah, you will see, as we have larger scale, you'll see, obviously, a continued price decrease in offshore wind.
So Liz, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Enjoy the rest of GreenBiz Verge, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun to be here. And I'm sorry I don't have a silly joke.
That's okay. Jay and I got plenty of them.
Okay,
it's
great.
cool.
Okay.
Yeah, but you laughed. I appreciated it, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Support for Sustainability Defined also comes from VaporFresh. So when we brought on VaporFresh, their founder and CEO, Steven Steinberg, offered to give me some samples of their new laundry detergent pods. He said these pods would eliminate sweat and odor from my gym clothes, but also work on all my other clothes. He also said the pods are formulated to work in cold water, which saves energy, a 90% reduction in energy use, and money, 60 cents per load. Soon thereafter came the opportunity to put these pods to the test. I had left wet clothes in a Ziploc bag for too long. They smelled horrible. I put these clothes with my regular clothes, washed in cold water with the pods, and they came out smelling fresh. I couldn't believe it. You can put Vapor Fresh pods to the challenge as well. Find them on Amazon or vaporfresh.com.
All right, Scott, unfortunately, wind doesn't blow all the time, and some gusts die down, just like this episode has just died down.
No, Jay, all we have to do is increase the high and low pressure, or the difference between the two, and then there's more wind. We went over this.
Fortunately, this is a renewable resource, and I think we'll be back for future episodes. This wind is not done for good. But as we wrap up, let's go ahead and run through a couple quick things. So first, head over to our Patreon page, which is live at patreon.com/sustainabilitydefined, where you can not only get your sweet Sustainability Defined sticker, but also have access to bonus content more often than our monthly episodes.
Yeah, as I was editing this episode, Jay, I had to cut some stuff that I thought was really good, but we just want to be cognizant of time, and we'll put it up on the Patreon page. It's still really good stuff, like Liz Burdock talking about the future of offshore wind.
And you bring up a good point, because it's like, we try to keep our episodes nice and tight, but of course there's all this other good information that is now being able to be put towards good use. So folks, go onto our Patreon page, just give us a small donation and check it out. It's good stuff.
Yeah, and so we also want to thank Square Peg Round Hole and Potions for our music.
As well as Max Saul and his girlfriend Laura Jackiel for the intro notes, and for Ben Pittler for helping us edit this episode.
And our main ask of you, I guess in addition to Patreon, is rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes. It really does help us get the word out and help us show up in search and recommendations. So please take the time, if you haven't already, to review us on iTunes and subscribe so you get all our new episodes right when they're released.
Scott, I think we have 57 5-star ratings. Why not 58?
Damn.
Or at least break 60.
Yeah.
Anyways, of course, we always love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. You can reach us at hosts, HOSTS, at sustainabilitydefined.com. We love connecting with you, hearing what you're interested in and what we might be able to help you out with.
Okay. I think that about does it, Jay. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.